Thank you all for joining today. Welcome. Today's session of the Federal Assistance E311 program is co-produced by the U.S. Conference of Mayors and Bloomberg Philanthropies. As those of you who've been longtime Federal Assistance E311 participants, or those of you who are new, this program was set up to help cities understand the federal funding that was coming as a result of the COVID pandemic. First, we were dealing with how do you go out and get those FEMA dollars that everyone so desperately needed. We've worked through the CARES Act money, and now we're really been focused a lot on the American Rescue Plan dollars. We're so excited that direct dollars have gone to cities, so you don't have to go through the states to get your needs met. But we also know that that means that there has been a tremendous amount of responsibility and pressure and challenges for cities. And so we're here to try to help you unpack that. And today's session is really building on the session that we had last week with the team at the U.S. Treasury Department talking about the updated FAQs that they issued in the end of March. And so what we're hoping to do here today is rely on our wonderful experts in the E311 program to be able to help us strategize around what does it mean with this updated guidance, and how do we make sure we meet those obligation and spending deadlines that they're coming just too quickly. We're also going to be hearing from some cities to hear about how they've been launching innovative programming and making sure that their dollars are spent. So the first thing we want to do is a little bit of an icebreaker. We'd love for you to share what is the most innovative or impactful thing that your city has been able to do with your state and local fiscal recovery dollars. We're interested to hear, and hopefully everyone can learn from each other. And if you have a question about what someone else puts into the chat, please reach out, raise your hand, put it in the chat, and follow up. This is meant to be an interactive session. So I'm going to pass it over. Paige, if you can go to the next slide. I'm going to pass it over to John Hagman at Haggerty Consulting and Matthew Hansen at Witt O'Brien, two of our federal funding experts, who are going to lead us through a discussion of this recent guidance and help us and help you all answer your burning questions on obligating, spending, reporting. So you name it, you ask it, and we'll try to answer it. Without further ado, I'll pass it along to John and Matt.
Thanks, Jamie. And if I can have the next slide. So we were waiting for a while for updated guidance from Treasury around obligation and expenditure. So the FAQs they issued, the new Section 17, as well as the series of webinars they've been doing, has been incredibly helpful. There are some things that I just want to highlight that has come out loud and clear from the Treasury webinars and guidance. One is the obligation expenditure deadlines are not going to be extended. Many of us were involved with CARES Act, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was extended at the 11th hour. We got another year. Treasury has made it perfectly clear that's not going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is those dates are actually in the legislation themselves. So they don't have the administrative flexibility to issue those extensions. So folks should absolutely be counting on obligation deadline of 12/31/24 and an expenditure deadline of 12/31/26. And when we talk about an expenditure deadline, unlike many federal grants, there is no 90-day closeout or liquidation period. It is projects completed, invoices paid, everything except the final reporting has to be done by 12/31/26. So make sure you're backing your timelines up. What is a little surprising is Treasury will not be issuing a final rule in response to the interim final rule they came out with for obligation expenditure. That is somewhat of a deviation from their past practices, but they have said that the FAQs and other guidance they've issued will serve as a final rule. So we are not expecting any additional guidance to come out around obligation and expenditure. A lot of folks are getting worked up around the obligation deadline, and really just a reminder why we have obligation deadlines. They're very much like having a draft of your term paper due, is to make sure your project is on track, and that's why the obligation deadline is there. is to make sure that the projects, the programmatic activity is on track to be completed and expended by the deadline. So yes, the obligation deadline is an administrative hurdle we have to get past. People should really focus on the why we have obligation deadlines, and that's to make sure projects are on track, projects will be completed, and projects will be expended on time. Treasury has provided what I believe to be a considerable amount of flexibility for meeting obligation deadlines. We'll talk a little bit more about interagency agreements, MOUs, and some of the other strategies they provided. I think there's plenty of tools there for all of us to work with, but it's flexibility within reason. So please make sure you're still looking at the details, the fine print, that sort of thing, to make sure you don't get arbitrarily tripped up when you're trying to utilize some of this enhanced flexibility. I cannot emphasize this last one enough. Do not deviate from your standard practices or policies just to meet obligation and expenditure deadlines. This happens with every large program. People are scrambling to meet these deadlines, and they're only focusing on the federal guidance, and they're not focusing on state and local policies, regulations, or practices. With all of this federal money, you have to comply with all federal, state, and local. And this is usually where people get tripped up. An example would be that as a business practice, your community only subscribes to IT licenses a year at a time, or you only pay a year at a time based on your fiscal year. And all of a sudden, to meet an obligation or expenditure deadline on a federal grant, you deviate from this and you prepay for 3 years, or you prepay for 5 years. That type of deviation from your standard practices will be something that gets caught in a monitoring visit. So, please be aware of that. And then finally, and I think John and I will talk about some of these, and our friends with the city of St. Louis. Right now is the time to be looking at your, plans B, C, D. Playing the scenarios. If this project doesn't happen, where do we move the money? If we need to use the revenue loss category to pay down, public sector payroll, really be working through those scenarios now, not in October, November, December, when you're right up against the obligation deadline. So next slide.
We are not seeing slides.
Go ahead, Matt.
Okay. As we work through that problem. So today we're going to talk about or really highlight 6 items that came to light in the news section 17 of the Treasury frequently asked questions. And then these are the same issues that Treasury really focused on in their various webinars. The use of interagency agreements. This was a pretty significant change. How to budget, how to obligate personnel cost, legal, administrative, and compliance cost. Some interesting flexibilities and strategies around contract replacement, amendment, and contingency cost after the 12/31/24 obligation deadline, use of excess funds, and then there's some other topics around interest and matching of some federal grant programs that we'll get into. Next slide. So interagency agreements. For those of you that were on the Treasury website or the Treasury webinar last week, this was their go-to item. They talked quite a bit about the use of intergovernmental service agreements, interagency agreements, MOUs, essentially agreements between departments and agencies within the same government unit. This is covered in quite extensively in FAQ 17.6. It is, in fact, a major reversal from previous guidance. Several months ago, Treasury had done a series of webinars and was asked point blank if an IGA, ISA would count as an obligation. And on the call, they said no, that was not going to be the case. And it became quite the topic of conversation, including at the National Grants Management Association meeting and others. So really excited that they've kind of reversed themselves. They have said that IGAs, ISAs will count as a form of obligation. And this is very much more in alignment with traditional uniform guidance and how we manage other grants. The one caveat, though, is conditions do apply. And when you look at 17.6, it can't just be a very generic IGA or ISA. It has to have specific language around the project to be delivered, financial costs, that sort of thing. So there is some specificity that you need to put into those IGAs, but certainly that's a quick and efficient way of obligating funding. A couple examples, you have a construction project, a capital project, getting those specs together, getting engineering, environmental is taking longer than you had hoped to. And all of that is delaying putting an RFP out on the street. You had hoped to have a project under contract by now. That contract would service your obligation, but for various reasons, the construction specs aren't coming together, delaying that procurement. Here's an example where you could enter into an interagency agreement between the city manager's office and any department, but here an example, the Public Works Department. This would obligate the funds in lieu of the vendor contract. So there's an example. Another one is, and this is an example that Treasury used quite a bit, if there's uncertainty around personnel cost or indirect cost, what you might need, what positions, that sort of thing. They highlighted this as a go-to, enter into an interagency agreement between the city manager's office and finance department to obligate the funds needed for grant administration. And this can be an up to amount, but it's another way of demonstrating that obligation. Next slide. Personnel cost is certainly been a topic since the interim final rule came out. This is covered in several of the FAQs, but probably most extensively in 17.7. Again, they're not issuing a final rule, so we're not expecting any more guidance to help us with the personnel cost issue. They did commit to developing a template that would help jurisdictions work through this process of deciding, what personnel costs they would have and how to report it for obligation perspective, or from an obligation perspective. The one thing I do want to highlight is we all need to understand the difference between administrative compliance cost and self-performance of programmatic activities. That was really what got a lot of people worked up, is because Treasury provided a list of positions, a list of activities, and they were all very administrative, compliance related, and not self-performance related. So we know full well that many of your cities, your public works folks are doing road projects and sidewalk projects and HVAC and that sort of thing. That is self-performance, and that is different, and that is clearly where that interagency agreement method comes into play. One of the other things that Treasury really highlighted was to focus on the position and not the individual. Folks were worried that if the person who was in the position left, would the obligation somehow go away? And that's where Treasury said, really focus on the position. If the position's currently filled or if there's turnover, because the obligation is related to the position, not the individual, then you don't have to worry about any sort of turnover. And then personnel cost is all in. So salary, fringe, supplies, travel, indirect. If not using the interagency agreement approach, create positions you think you might need, even if you're not planning on filling them immediately. pad that obligation so you have enough resources. I mean, we still have 2.5 years plus worth of managing these grants. So be thinking long-term. And then build in cost escalation into estimates, build in, automatic salary increases or, what you would expect to see from an inflationary perspective on supplies and travel. Don't leave yourself short when putting these obligation estimates together. Next slide. So legal and administrative cost, this guidance is very similar to the guidance that was issued with the CARES Act and the Coronavirus Relief Fund. It is covered in FAQ 17.5. Really plan for the unexpected. So Treasury is now just monitoring the CARES Act CRF funding. I think there's a lot of folks who feel like, they never heard from Treasury with CRF. They haven't heard anything from Treasury related to their ARPA funding. So there really isn't going to be a lot of monitoring and oversight. That is not the case. They are just, it's just taking them a while to get through. Right now, they are actually going through paycheck protection program conversations. They're looking right now at nonprofit statuses of organizations who got paycheck protection programs. So plan for the unexpected, plan for the long haul, and make sure you have the resources you need going forward. The Treasury template for personnel costs will be helpful here as well, but I really believe the simplest approach is going to be the interagency agreement, just due to the number of uncertainties. One item or one approach we are seeing is moving go-forward administrative compliance cost out of the fiscal recovery fund dollars and into the accrued interest dollars. This makes sure that you're obligating all of your ARPA dollars positively in the time. And then also by using the interest, it makes sure you have available financial resources to pay for legal and administrative support beyond that 12/31/26 deadline for any closeout activities, final reporting, document retention, single audit follow-up, et cetera. So I know early on in the program, folks were generating very little interest. In the last 18 months, that's not the case. Even small jurisdictions have accrued 100,000, 200,000. Some larger jurisdictions in the millions. As you know, that money is not limited by any of the ARPA requirements. So one thing to think about is, do you move your legal and administrative cost into that interest pot of money separate from the program dollars? With that, I will hand it off to John.
Great, thanks, Matt. You all hear me okay? Great. As Matt said at the kickoff, one of the other significant areas where we've seen, you can go back to the next slide, where we've seen updated guidance and Treasury really clarifying some of its previous guidance is around contract replacement, amendment, and contingencies. Treasury has confirmed what they've stated in the past, where recipients are permitted to replace a contract or subaward entered into prior to 12/31/24 under a few circumstances. And those circumstances require that the replacement contract has to be within the same scope and purpose of the original contract, and meet one of several conditions. Either the contractor or subrecipient defaults, goes out of business, or is unable to perform or carry out an award. There's some type of mutual termination, or the contract was not properly awarded in the first place. And so I think the first element of that around ability to carry out or perform the work, I think speaks in a really powerful way to performance of your contractors and the subrecipients that you're working with. To the extent that you've seen folks not be able to deliver up to your standards over the last several years, you have flexibility to course correct, to increase performance, and ultimately deliver services for your constituents. The other important piece associated with replacing contracts is to ensure that the documentation is in place to justify those determinations. Treasury has explicitly called out that they plan or may request from recipients to provide this information in periodic reporting. So to the extent you are replacing one contractor with another contractor for any reason, or replacing a subrecipient with a new subrecipient for any reason, it's going to be important to ensure you're meeting, one, the conditions that are laid out by Treasury in the FAQs, but also have a documented trail associated with that. For example, many of you, your procurement offices might have vendor performance scorecards or supplier performance scorecards. I certainly know when I was with the city of Detroit, we did a lot of work to ensure that our contractors and vendors were performing construction projects and other type of projects appropriately. Sometimes those forms may not be completed on a regular basis. So it's important to work with your procurement office and your other agencies to ensure that if there is poor performance, that is documented. So you're able to, if you do replace those contracts in the future, able to justify that if Treasury were to ask. Treasury also did mention that they'll plan to update the SLFRF compliance and reporting guidance to provide a means for recipients to report contracts or subaward or replacements after the December 31st, 2024 deadline. So be on the lookout for those updates to that specific guidance document. The other major area, if you could go back, the other major area associated with contract replacement amendments and contingencies is around cost increases. We all know that projects don't necessarily go as planned, and for one reason or the other, there may be increasing costs associated with the project due to inflation or due to other unforeseen circumstances. Treasury has provided recipients the flexibility now to pay for those cost increases after the 12/31/2024 deadline. And in order to do that, recipients are going to need to estimate the funds that may be used to pay for those cost increases in the obligation amount that is reported to Treasury according to the obligation deadline. So as you're thinking about your projects and evaluating which of those may already be running above budget or which of those may see cost increases in the future, you really want to spend your time now estimating what those cost increases could be and making sure you've calculated those amounts, understand the drivers behind them, and then are able to report that as part of your obligation amount to Treasury prior to the 12/31/2024 deadline. And I'll call out FAQ 17.16 for how to operationalize this through Treasury's reporting. Additionally, you're really going to want to take a look at the contracts that you have in place right now to ensure that they have the language necessary to give yourself that flexibility moving forward. For example, many of our clients and you all may have issued contracts years ago to procure goods or services for SLFRF purposes, and you may only have amendments that go into 2025. But your intent is, for example, to still use that contractor through the period of performance. You're going to want to take a look at your contracts, your subrecipient agreements, to make sure that you have the contractual flexibility to amend contracts, so long as you're staying within Treasury's parameters, of course, in the future. And you really want to be doing that now ahead of the 2024 deadline, so you don't find yourself in a situation in 2025 where you'd like to amend the contract, where you're meeting Treasury's requirements, but you don't necessarily have the provisions in the contract itself to enable that amendment. Can flip to the next slide. The other major component that Matt mentioned at the start is around the use of excess funds, where those excess funds may come from, and what the eligible uses of those excess funds may be. And so Treasury has very clearly stated that recipients can use excess funds for another eligible use, so long as the recipient had an obligation in place by December 31st, 2024. We've included on this slide, I think, a really helpful table that lays out where those excess funds could come from, whether they're projects. We talked about project overruns, but oftentimes, as you all have been moving through project implementation, perhaps some projects are coming under budget. That could create excess funds that could be used for other purposes. Program income could be higher than you all originally estimated, and program income may be growing because of reallocation decisions to newer projects that may be generating program income. That's another place where excess funds can be reallocated from. Legal and administrative estimates, to the extent that you haven't had to use administrative costs at the same levels that you all have projected, that's another place where excess funds can be pulled from. And then personnel estimates, as Matt talked about, you all may have positions funded through SLFRF. There could have been hiring delays that created excess funds or savings. Perhaps the salary that an employee came into in the position is under budget from what you all previously estimated. And so it's important to have a sense of where those excess funds are coming from, but then just as importantly, understanding what eligible uses of those excess funds could be. And Treasury has spelled out what those are. I'll run through a few here. To another eligible project or another eligible use. So if you've had a project obligated before the deadline, you're seeing cost increases, you could take excess funds elsewhere and apply that to that use. Similarly, associated with upward cost adjustments in contracts for subawards. To the extent that there are additional legal and administrative costs due to unforeseen circumstances, perhaps the subrecipients you're working with have become higher risk and require additional monitoring. And those administrative costs weren't originally projected in your estimates. There's flexibility to use those costs. And similarly, on the personnel side, as Matt mentioned, so long as there are positions created and or interagency or MOU agreements in place, that's another area where excess funds can be used. Can flip to the next slide. And then just to round out, there's a few other major and minor changes through this new guidance. Again, all SLFRF funds under any eligible category, including revenue loss, are subject to the obligation requirements. We've certainly seen articles circulated and some confusion around our revenue loss funds subject to the obligation requirement. Treasury has been very clear on that. They reiterated that in this last round of FAQs. They've also updated when those cost estimates that we've talked about need to be reported. For quarterly reporters, that's going to be January 31st of 2025. And for annual reporters, April 30th of 2025. So you have some time now to really take a detailed look and come up with those estimates to make sure that you're giving yourself flexibility in the future. Another area that's been discussed a lot is whether subrecipients or contractors are subject to the obligation deadline. Treasury has been clear on that and reiterated that they're not subject to that obligation deadline. What's important is that the recipient is adhering to the obligation deadline. And so that could give you all more flexibility through your subrecipients to have more time to obligate funds moving forward. Overall, I think it's really important as you all now are far along into spending these dollars to think about this new guidance in the context of your actual projects and think about what type of assessment may need to occur to assess the status of your projects. How is spending going? Are you on track from a spend perspective? What contracts or subrecipient agreements are in place to continue administering those projects, and do any changes need to occur in those contracts and subrecipients? What are your priorities? Are you seeing shifting priorities because of new elected officials, or because of different unmet needs that you had compared to a year ago? Understanding where some of those changes might occur from a priority level and how that could impact your projects and the administrative support required is going to be really important. At this point, you want to maximize the flexibility that you all have over the next several years to make changes as necessary as projects close or come to a conclusion, and to give yourself the ability to reallocate those funds elsewhere so you're not leaving any money on the table. With that, I'm really excited to turn it over to Noel from the city of St. Louis. We've had the pleasure of working with Noel for some time now, and so I'm really excited for him to be able to share more about the important work that the city of St. Louis has been doing with their ARPA dollars and investing in their community.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, John, and thank you, everyone, for pulling these sessions together. They've been truly invaluable as we all navigate this dynamic landscape. I'm so excited to share a little bit about our work in St. Louis. To be transparent, I'm not sure that we have all the same questions that everyone else has, but I do think that we have a few answers in terms of how we're approaching some of our SLRF admin, as well as revolving loan funds, which we'll talk a little bit about. But before we dive into those details, I want to just start by giving a little bit of background about ARPA in St. Louis and just a timeline. So if we can go to the next slide. The text is a little bit small, but essentially this just lays out the overall arc of appropriations and how we've approached this in a community-driven and data-informed process. Before I stepped into my current role as leader of the city's Community Development Administration, which administers both HUD and now the bulk of the city's ARPA funds, I served as the mayor's director of policy. And we had the privilege of Mayor Jones was inaugurated a month after the American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law. And so this was from day one of our, if not our, top priority. And we convened a stimulus advisory board of community leaders and stakeholders. We issued an ARPA needs survey, which received over 5,000 responses. And we essentially appropriated the funds in tranches, starting with direct relief, which was really household assistance, food assistance, rent relief, small business grants, basic income, and other kind of direct relief programs before moving to infrastructure. And then ultimately, the top priority that has emerged is economic justice. And that's because, as I'll talk about a little bit in a future slide, we recognize, that our disproportionately impacted community is predominantly in North St. Louis, that St. Louis has a history of segregation, and that we can't grow as a city until we heal some of those scars. But throughout it all, we have balanced essentially the needs of direct relief of investments into infrastructure and long-term capital with an infrastructure including streets, sidewalks, parks, our 911 system, community Wi-Fi, and other programs, and then this broader vision about economic justice, which I'll talk some more about. And then most recently, just this month, we reappropriated about 15 million. We went through a long risk assessment process, and I'll talk a little bit about this in our next slide, if we can go to our next slide. So some of our lessons learned. The very first one is flexible appropriations. When we first started, we were very prescriptive in terms of we want to fund this program for 1.2 million and this program for 500, et cetera, et cetera. Lately, we've learned to do larger flexible appropriations, and we're going to continue this as we do another round of reappropriations in September, whereas John and Matt were talking about, we have an array of options for plans B, C, and D in terms of we have a large volume of revenue replacement funds that we have yet to tap kind of that availability. Our revenue replacement kind of threshold is nearly 400 million out of our $498 million award. However, we've only allocated about $200 million to revenue replacement to date. And so we are prepared to, if necessary, shift a lot of funds to revenue replacement and to some of the city's infrastructure and operational needs, with a particular focus on the water department as well, which a recent round of engagement has really highlighted as a priority and as a need. But again, what we recently went through is a round of looking through every single department, what are our commitments, our funding awards, our reserved funds, our obligations, expenditures, et cetera. We've spent currently as a city over $100 million of the 500 million, and expenditures are increasing exponentially. And we have about $350 million obligated. And so as we do approach the end of 2024, there is a lot of work to be done. However, in this initial round of risk assessment, and it's really an iterative process with departments, because one of the interesting things, having been previously in the mayor's office, now at the departmental level, you see the really critical importance of an ongoing dialogue, because implementation is decentralized. And so when we go out to the departments, they say, we're still moving forward with this project, we're committed to it. And that's why the risk assessment needs to really assess both compliance risk and operational risks in terms of capacity. Are we going to be able to hire the personnel to fill these positions by 2024? Because we know Treasury says that we need to have these positions filled by 2024. Are we going to be able to go through the full procurement process? What legal resources need to be deployed in order to have funds obligated before 2024, et cetera? But in this first round, we only wound up reappropriating about 14 million and really divided programs into three categories. This is moving, it's going great, we don't need to worry about it. We are worried about this, we're reappropriating it, and then a large category in the middle of we're going to come back in a few months, we're going to keep a close eye on it. And then in September is what we've really identified as the drop dead date, where we are going to have our final reappropriation and move everything into its final kind of destination. Another lesson learned is about building subrecipient capacity. From the beginning, we have taken the position that Treasury thankfully clarified recently that subrecipients are not subject to the 2024 obligation deadline. We felt that there was a strong case to be made from the original final rule based on the definition of obligation that included subawards as a legitimate basis for obligations. And while that was in tension with the general idea that subrecipients are subject to all uniform administrative guidance and all the rules that a recipient is subject to, we're glad that that tension was resolved in what we always felt was the most logical way. And so from the beginning, we invested in subrecipient capacity, and our department, for example, has awarded over $100 million to the St. Louis Development Corporation, which is our nonprofit sister agency, 501c4 corporation that serves as a kind of more flexible, nimble development arm for the city, but is a subrecipient and a fully private 501c4 nonprofit. And of course, they have through 2026 to continue obligating funds, and that gives us a great amount of flexibility. I also want to shout out Haggerty, who we're currently working with on our policies and procedures, for bringing this a really wonderful template into our compliance world with these project information sheets, which now serve essentially as cover pages to all of our project files, and have really helped us organize and crystallize our eligibility justifications, among other items. Another lesson learned that I didn't include here, but that I want to highlight, is the importance of balancing the risks of action and inaction. And that said, I think all of our processes in our compliance world are designed to dramatize the risks of action, of course, of audit findings or worse, question costs and repayment. But there's also very real risks to inaction and failing to obligate funds. And that's political risk, but it's also a very real risk to the disproportionately impacted populations which ARPA has called on us to serve. And so we're always conscious of the need to balance those two risks in our decision-making processes, which is not to say we discount or ignore the risks of action and audit risk. We are very conscious of it, but we balance it. Turning now to, I've talked a little bit about the reappropriation and obligation funds, but I do want to talk about the obligation interim final rule, and especially how it approaches anticipated administrative expenditures. And in particular, CDA was created in 1974 to administer HUD funds. And we have a practice that HUD has handed down to us that I think is actually very instructive for this question that has been discussed about how do we leverage interagency agreements, and in particular in the context of administration. And that is that for our CDBG admin program, we enter into an administrative work program, which is an executed contract with ourselves. It sounds absurd. I hated it when I first arrived here. I thought it didn't really make sense. But what it does is that contract has as signatories CDA, myself, but also the city councilor's office and our chief financial officer. And this is a system that HUD has blessed for us to essentially say, here are our administrative work program. Here are the outputs and criteria. If we were doing this for ARPA, which we are taking as our outputs and criteria the various categories that that interim final rule, obligation interim final rule, details in terms of reporting and compliance costs, civil rights, not environmental review for ARPA, but all these different categories that are listed there at 8586 in the interim final rule are different outputs. And then we have an administrative budget, job descriptions of how the different positions are going to allow us to meet these outputs and criteria. And whether we do it as a MOU or a formal contract or an intergovernmental agreement, I think the idea of having the sign off from the city councilor and the CFO as well as the department makes a lot of sense in terms of producing what we're talking about here. We also talked about, and John and Matt talked about FAQ 17.16, which allows us to reallocate and re-obligate funds effectively after 2024 from a project that has failed to move forward for whatever reason to one that may be going over budget or may have a change order that allows it to expand its budget. And one of the things that we've done here is, one, we just have a very diversified portfolio of projects with dozens of housing projects, as well as a variety of vacancy, beautification, community Wi-Fi. It's a long list. And so that allows us to, prepares us well to shift funds as needed. But critically, these projects and these contracts have a deadline built into them, which essentially says if the entity fails to expend funds by a given deadline, that lends itself to a presumptive inability to complete the work, which ties into the language of FAQ 17.16, which essentially speaks to termination based on the recipient's determination that the grantee is unable to complete the work. And so again, this is setting ourselves up to be able to shift funds in accordance with FAQ 17.16 after 2024. If we go to the next slide. I doubt that I have time to do this justice, but I'll just share before I get to the revolving loan funds that the revolving loan funds are a means to an end. and that end is economic justice. If you look at the city of St. Louis, you'll see that we've been fractured by design, decades of restrictive covenants, appraisal gaps, redlining, urban renewal projects, quote unquote, highways demolishing predominantly Black neighborhoods have all led to scars on the city that you can see in terms of vacant land. That's the map in the middle. An economic justice index that we developed to essentially set a disproportionately impacted geography that was almost identical and coterminous with QCTs, but just a little bit different. But then you can also see that the awards that we've made are aligned with that need. And I don't have the time to go further into it. If we go to the next slide, because I want to get to revolving loan funds. This is just the need dramatically it outweighs the funds that we have available, which is why we do have to leverage and revolve our funding with a series of private and philanthropic sources. Next slide. And then here are 4 different examples of revolving loan funds, and they're all a little bit different in terms of how we approach compliance. And there's not a one-size-fits-all. I'll start on the top left side with our for sale affordable housing revolving loan fund, where we've allocated $10 million of ARPA funds to the development of for sale homes. And what we've done is we've also leveraged these with new market tax credits through SLDC as our subrecipient. And so we entered into a subrecipient agreement with SLDC. This is all, if you look at the ARPA Affordable Housing How-To Guide, relying on the home eligibility criteria in terms of income restrictions, affordability period, tenant protections, and quality standards. And one additional really interesting thing about home is that it's, if you look at home 92.504, you'll see that it has a variety of different definitions for different entities that you can award home funds for. There are subrecipients, there are contractors, but there's also developers. And developers are a lot like beneficiaries in homes world, in that they're not subject to program income requirements, they're not subject to procurement, they're not subject to a lot of these units. What they are subject to is asset management, but basically we have to hold them to these affordability requirements. And similarly, actually, if you look at the neighborhood stabilization program back in 2012, you'll see that, and the neighborhood stabilization program was built on the CDBG chassis. You'll see that HUD essentially said, for NSP purposes, for CDBG purposes, again, we are going to treat developers as beneficiaries. So our position, and we've submitted a question to Treasury trying to get this clarified formally, but is that developers of affordable housing are best characterized as beneficiaries, especially when they're receiving loans. And the way that this works is, again, there's a subrecipient agreement between CDA and SLDC. Then SLDC, our subrecipient, provides a forgivable loan to the new market tax credits community development entity. And then that community development entity lends the funds to a NMTC eligible Qualic B who develops that affordable housing and repays upon sale. And one interesting thing I can note is that while Treasury never provided us a formal response, this program, and we have spent these funds, has been, SLDC was audited, and the auditor supported this program design. I'll also note the Small Business Revolving Loan Fund is more what you might imagine as a classic or typical revolving loan fund, that really we are following the path provided by Treasury in FAQ 4.9. Which essentially we are providing low interest loans to eligible small businesses. We're leveraging $2 million of ARPA funds with an $8 million commitment by BJC, a hospital, a major hospital in St. Louis, for low interest capital. And we're funding the subsidy cost essentially of these loans. And essentially what we do is we, again, enter into a subrecipient agreement with SLDC. SLDC is contracting with a community credit union, the St. Louis Community Credit Union. And then we're calculating that subsidy cost in accordance with GSA and the language of FAQ 4.9 by essentially running a counterfactual and saying, what would the interest on these loans be if they were at the credit union's typical interest rate? And we discount everything, obviously, according to the credit union's cost of finance, cost of funds, versus what the interest payments are at this subsidized rate. And then debt payments are reinvested. However, loans may also have maturities post 2026. That's the big payoff of approaching this by funding the subsidy cost, because it essentially allows us to revolve this past 2026. With proactive development and site assembly fund, and I apologize, I'm going long, so I'll try and make this quick. But in this case, we decided to fund these with revenue replacement funds to allow greater disposition flexibility. So this is a program where SLDC acquires and develops vacant properties and then may sell them or ground lease them as the case may be. But either way, it does generate program income or property disposition revenue, but revenue replacement, as we know, thanks to FAQs 13.15 and 13.16, does not trigger these same requirements. And then finally, we have a contractor mobilization revolving loan fund, where essentially we are providing these low interest loans to small contractors who are ready to compete for larger, often public construction projects, but don't have the scale and the liquidity to mobilize. And this then allows them to mobilize, and then they can pay back the loan, the low interest loan, upon winning the bid and beginning to be reimbursed. A final project that I'll mention, that even though it's not on here and it's not, again, a classic revolving loan fund, is our private building stabilization fund, where essentially we are activating the authority of our building division to bring privately owned properties up to code where they are in violation of city code. And so we're essentially notifying these problem property owners, many of them whom are out of state, that we will, that either they need to bring their property up to code or the city will. And then if they don't bring the property up to code, we do, and then we add that to their special tax bill. And again, they either pay that into the special, as a special tax, and it comes back to the city, or the city gets the property. And again, we're doing that with revenue replacement funds. So I know I've gone over, so I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Noel. Really appreciate it. If anyone has any questions, please put them into the chat. We're going to go to our next city representative, Ken Hillebrand from the city of Louisville, to talk a little bit about the work that they're doing. We also know there's been a lot of questions, and I know Matt and John have been answering a bunch of them in the chat. We also, if folks want to stay on a little past 3, if you have more questions, we can do that as well. I'm going to pass it over to Ken. Thank you, Ken. Ken, I think you might be muted. Sometimes there's that sneaky double mute that happens. No, I can read lips though. All right, while we work on Ken's audio, why don't we take a question, and we'll get this all figured out. One of the questions that had been pre-submitted came from the city of Fort Collins, and it was about when we'll be getting guidance for the submission of administrative and compliance expenses due July 31st, 2024. Matt or John, would you be able to answer that one if we have an answer?
I can jump in. I'm not sure if Treasury's given an exact date. I think the best thing you can do right now is estimate, those costs with some reasonable assumptions behind them. We know from the FAQs that Treasury has given more guidance on the type of information that has to justify those estimates, right, moving forward. So I would focus now on preparing those estimates with those assumptions. And then as Treasury either comes out with a template or updates the compliance and reporting guidance, look for kind of the exact template or model that they're going to use. But the most important piece is to understand what those projections are, the assumptions behind those projections, and get that documented. So you can be ready to make that information available in whatever form or template that Treasury releases.
Thank you, John. Ken, how are you doing? You got anything?
I'm good. You hear me?
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
So if you just want to jump to slide 9 on here, because that's the one that I think it'll have April 30th on there. Go another one. No, they're right there. Okay, so this is a presentation I've done for our directors a couple months ago. I just did this for our grant administrators and just setting up deadlines for them so that we can make decisions here in Louisville. And the first one is April 30th. I really want to know from all the projects that have not yet obligated their funds. I need a clear path on getting those funds obligated or getting them obligated by April 30th. We had one that obligated, I think, $7.5 million today. So we were all dancing. So that was great. And part of that reason is now next week, the mayor gives his budget address. And I want to make sure that the Louisville Accelerator team about the American Rescue Plan projects, we're on the same page as the agencies when they go into those budget hearings, because the council members are going to ask questions about how those projects are going. Next slide. And then what we're going to do in July is we're going to check on that obligation plan. How's it going? Are they really doing it? We're going to verify that the subrecipients are actually going to be able to do the work. And then the next slide is in September, we're going to take action. We're going to say, okay, if you're not able to do this work, we're going to reallocate it as needed. I'm not yet sharing with everyone that we have options to obligate funds to other projects. I'm really trying to say, let's stick to this and keep going. I don't want to introduce a lot of complexity at this point. It is something I'm sharing with the mayor and the administration, but for the agencies that are executing on these projects, it's like, we got to keep going. Don't stop. And next slide. So our council in 2022 set up something we call an ARP reconciliation account. So as a project ends, unexpended funds go into this ARP reconciliation account that we can use for general government services up to the amount allowed by revenue replacement, or and then what's allowed by Treasury. So we kind of have that in our back pocket at the end of this year, so that our Metro Council and the administration can make a decision, say, okay, we have 5 million, 10 million left. Let's use it for something that's covered by revenue loss calculations, and it's going to be the library or whatever it is that we need to do, where we're still need more money for building a new library or making repairs or replacement to some libraries or other projects in parks departments. So that's kind of what our plan is.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing. I think that it's as Ken is showing here, I think it's really important, and John and Matt have been stressing this, to have these, stock takes, making sure things are on track to be able to meet these deadlines, because as we heard, they're not changing. So we have to meet them. And thank you for everyone who has filled out the poll. If you haven't yet filled out the poll, we would really love to get your insights, because it will help us to be able to put together other workshops, resources, templates, or coaching sessions that can address these procurement delays. I know is one that a lot of cities are struggling with, and so we can put together some frameworks and advice on that. I'm going to also just remind everyone that I've included the link to request a one-on-one session with John, Matt. We also have other experts who deal with reporting issues and compliance issues. So please do reach out. These are all free sessions, free advice. So we want to help you. We want cities to do as much as you can with these ARPA dollars. For those of you who have a 3 o'clock calendar obligation, obviously feel free to drop. If John and Matt are able to indulge us for a few more minutes, we had gotten a bunch more pre-submitted questions. I'd love to try to address a couple. One that we got from Burlington, Vermont, is use of SLFRF funds to pay for police salaries due to increased gun violence and Met salaries due to increased overdose calls also considered part of the $10 million revenue replacement? Or is this considered part of the public safety, public health response? You want to be able to take that for us?
John, happy to. Jamie, there's a pathway forward for either approach. It would there's a allowability justification that can be done under the traditional expenditure categories, or certainly it would fall under the revenue loss. So those activities align with stated allowability of the ARPA funds.
And I would assume it's if you have other things that can't be used for revenue loss, use those for the revenue loss, and because you have an allowable category here, seems like that's the maybe better way to go.
Yeah, and then there's always the fund something else to free up general fund if it comes to that. But with these two particular items, you don't have to go that far to use the funding.
Great. We got a question from Toledo. Does an ordinance authorizing expenditure of ARPA funds with a subrecipient entity with an accompanying subrecipient agreement, including scope of work for eligible uses of ARPA funds for each project, suffice for obligating funds?
I think the piece is the subrecipient agreement. Treasury's been clear that passing an ordinance isn't the same as obligating the funds. So yeah, I think it's important to disentangle those elements. And when you're thinking about obligation, really focusing on the subrecipient agreement and ensuring that the funds are obligated through a subrecipient agreement. You very well may have an ordinance that passed and it provides other provisions that you're bound by from a local perspective, but in Treasury's mind, when it comes to obligating funds and a subrecipient, you really want to have that subrecipient agreement.
Yeah, and I would agree. If there's a subrecipient agreement, it needs to be fully executed, fully signed, not just a draft or a template of a subrecipient agreement. If it's not going to be fully executed or signed, then that ordinance needs to go one step forward and actually be an MOU interagency agreement with the city department who will ultimately manage the program, manage the subawards. So just identifying who will receive the money and having a template or a draft of a subrecipient agreement doesn't go far enough.
Great. We got a question in the chat from Lisa Gummersall. Is a large shift to revenue replacement towards the end of 2024 going to raise red flags? Or is it okay as long as you have the capacity?
It's fine as long as you have the capacity. It's not the use of revenue loss is not a compliance issue. So it's not like you're doing a bait and switch or anything. So if you're under the $10 million standard allowance, or you have capacity under a calculated method, then by all means take advantage of it.
Yeah, I might feel uncomfortable, but Treasury on numerous occasions in their guidance, when they talk about the intent, it's really to provide flexibility to recipients. So to the extent you have revenue loss funding available, we've had clients shift allocations for one reason or the other from other categories to revenue loss because of administrative burden or because of other reasons.
Great. And I think we've already addressed this, but I just want to make sure we've totally closed it out. We've gotten a question from Erie, Pennsylvania. Please address ARPA estimates for payroll costs, which I know we talked about. Is this extension limited to administrative costs only? We said no. If we have the capacity, is it better to use these funds as revenue replacement and set aside to fund payroll? That last piece, I think we haven't touched on.
Personally, I think anytime you have the capacity to use a revenue loss, do it. It's an administrative easy button. That being said, I think when Treasury comes out with the template they promised, that will be insightful, but not just with personnel costs, but with programmatic activity as well. Whenever you can use that administrative easy button from a compliance, allowability, uniform guidance flow down, reporting perspective, then take advantage of the revenue loss provision.
Great. I think those are the questions we've all received. Did anyone else have any other questions? I also just want to remind folks, if anyone has a port, if you are a wet port, a dry port, an inland port, we are having a session starting in 25 minutes. To see my face again, talking about ports and how to get money out of the Clean Ports program. So I'm going to put a link to register for today's call. If you're interested in a port, it will also be recorded and will be on the Local Infrastructure Hub website, which I'm also going to put in the chat. If any of you have not been participating in our Local Infrastructure Hub programming, it is all about how to access federal dollars for your infrastructure priorities, both out of the investment sorry, Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. So encourage you all to participate. We're going to be having more of these. Please request one-on-one sessions. Thank you so much to John, to Matt, to Noel, and to Ken for sharing all these guides with us. Thank you to everyone for all your questions. Makes the session a lot more fun when we're not just talking to ourselves. And if you have anything that you want us to see us do a workshop on, please reach out. We're happy to plan something, and we want to make sure, like we said, every dollar gets well spent. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, guys.